Okay, so you're here. It's beautiful outside. Right. Thank you for coming. So uh, my talk has this horribly nerdy title: "Process Tracing Between Broadening and Deepening." Ugh, yeah, right. You're asleep before I even start. So we're going to begin. Okay, step back a bit before we get to the nerd stuff, right? And little, I want to sort of walk you through and think why methodologically where we've gotten so hung up on measuring and seeing process. And this little digression, I'm going to call it social science in the social world, snapshots and motion pictures, and is italicized there, right? And I'm sort of two different ways to think about how the social science world has grappled with this connecting snapshots and motion pictures. The mainstream way, positivism, critical realism, right? So how are they sort of developing explanations? Well, we have variables, we have factors, right? But people, and this was part of the philosophy of social science discussion, but also in disciplines like political science, the last 25 years or so, people were saying, well, that's too static, right? We need dynamics and process, okay? So if you want to think about it in terms of causality, right? I mean, yeah, so these factors and variables, they can be measured, they produce causal effects. But then people say, well, don't we also need causal mechanisms for a more complete explanation? The causal logics, right, are evolving, right? I mean, quantitatively, right, causal effects, it's a frequentist logic, right? It happens a lot of times, and that means there's something causal going on, right? With the mechanisms, it's not frequentist. I'm not sure what the logic is. It's non-frequentist, and there's some debate now. Maybe it's Bayesian. We can talk about that later. A mechanism happens one time, and that has causal force to change an outcome. Okay, so that's painting, right? The philosophy of social science behind all this stuff. I mean, it's positivism, right? Lots along with critical scientific realism. You need that for the unobservable mechanisms, because positivism has problems with unobservables. Who's doing this? Well, it started, I guess there's a lot of sociologists, right, in your department, or it's mostly sociologists, right? I better be careful because I'm not. Well, I mean, who was doing this? Well, the analytic sociologists were one of the first in sociology who started talking about causal mechanisms. I mean, when I teach this stuff on processing, causality, causal mechanisms, I still like this piece from Annual Review of Sociology by Hedstrom. Maybe you guys can finally help me pronounce the second name, Ulikowski. On causal mechanisms. It's a great piece. So analytic sociologists, back early 2000s, talking about causal mechanisms, and all kinds of political scientists over the 20 years. So what happens? I mean, this development, right, in sort of the mainstream, right? Well, the end point is we're sort of combining snapshots compared to statics and motion pictures, causal mechanisms. And the implications for research design are mixed methods, right? Or one kind of mixed methods. What are the implications for process methods, right? Well, these folks, you scratch them a little bit, they'll start talking about process tracing, that very phrase. And if they're really into the stuff, they'll say, oh, there's standard process tracing and there's Bayesian process tracing. I'll talk more about both of these. So it's one way, sort of put this social world into motion, okay, the mainstream way. But there's something else that's been going on. I'll call it the interpretive way. And here, the discussion was, well, it's like 20 years ago. Yeah, we got these key concepts: discourse, field, habitus. They're a bit static, a bit structural. The social world's in motion, right? And we're not capturing that. So these folks start talking about the need to add sort of dynamics and practice, not necessarily to their causal explanations, but to their understandings of the social world. Causality, if it's there, is local causality. Okay, it happened in a causal way in this place at this time, but that's all. It doesn't extend anywhere else. or many times it's non-causal, right? It's about meaning making. The logics, frequentism doesn't make any sense, or Bayesianism doesn't make any sense. These folks talk about logics of habit, logic of practice, driving a social world forward. And I'll come back to this practice stuff later. The philosophical underpinning, it's like continental social theory. That's the stuff across the channel, right? Plus pragmatist theories of action. Who's doing this? Well, actually, it's sociologists taking the lead again. A very different group of sociologists: Pierre Bourdieu, Fields, Habitus, and interpretive political scientists. And they brought the stuff in from sociology. They call themselves the practice term, right? These are people like Rebecca Adler-Nissen, Eva Neumann here in Europe, Amanda Adler in Canada, Israel now, Vincent Pilot in Canada. And sort of the endpoint here for this interpretive way of putting the social world in motion is the snapshots are there still, which for them were discourses, okay? But motion pictures have come in too. And these are social practices, not causal mechanisms, social practices. The implications for research design are it's multi-method, multi-qualitative method. The implications for process methods, here's where it gets really messy. Well, maybe it's the same practice tracing, which I'm going to talk a lot more about. That's very similar to process tracing. Praxeography they talk about, following methods, different ways to sort of capture the interpretive social world in motion. Okay, so that's sort of, a really oversimplified view of sort of the mainstream movement to putting the social world into motion and the interpretive way of doing it. And so I'm doing this for a reason, obviously. I mean, there's two takeaways. I hope you, well, I would suggest you take away from this little digression. In terms of method, process analytics is much more than process tracing, okay? Even though I want you to buy this Bennett and Checkel book. People know about that book, please buy it. It's 6,000 copies sold. It's an academic book. I actually still like making money on it, which is never supposed to happen. Yeah, but it is process analytics is much more than process traces. That's a methodological takeaway. There's at least for me personally, there's a professional ethics takeaway from sort of these different social science ways of putting the social world into motion, thinking in processual terms. In terms of professional ethics, for me, I mean, I feel it's my job and actually ethical responsibility as an academic and part-time methodologist, if that's what I am, to equip the next generation of scholars with the richest set of tools possible to access, to measure, to interrogate the processual complexity of our social world. Okay, so the argument, building all that, is to push or I think actually Mark said this in the introduction. I mean, I think there's a need for sort of a mid-course correction to the research and teaching agenda we have right now on what I will call process analytics. This is sort of a more encompassing term than process tracing. These process analytics are about the collection and analysis of the data on processes and dynamics, the stuff that puts the social world into motion, okay? In recent years, if you look at the literature, we made important advances in the analysis part. And I'm going to call that, and that's most clearly seen in the growing literature on Bayesian process tracing, which has given us a deeper, maybe getting closer to the truth method. Yet to do the data analysis well requires rich, high quality data. And I would argue that students of process analytics need to think harder about this data collection, the front end of the method, as it were. Most important, that means a greater focus as we collect data on what I'll call within process tracing methods and research ethics. And then finally, I think we need to broaden how we collect and analyze our data by developing a robust interpretive form of process analytics. And again, that's coming sort of what I just think it's, for me, it's just important to do because this stuff is out there. It's developing in the interpretive social science world. And I think we should connect to it and see where we can make connections or learn from each other. Okay, so the bottom line then is links back to my horrible title. What's it called? Process tracing between broadening. That was a snore, right? Broadening. Actually, it sounds like a Chingala. Anybody Italian? Okay, I was getting picked up by a taxi at 3:30 this morning. We live a bit in the countryside. It's a wild boar. Just down the hillside, and that's what they sound like that. And you don't want to get close to a Chingala. They're very big. So yeah, my boring title, right? To link back to that title, process tracing between broadening and deepening, right? The next stage in developing process analytics should focus on broadening, okay? Its epistemological basis, the front-end data collection, and its research ethics, or its maybe commitment to research ethics. I would argue, I am arguing, this agenda is going to give students of process methods a richer, more ethically grounded, meta-theoretically plural set of tools for measuring and accessing all that cool stuff out there in the social world. Now you can tune out and look out the window, right? Because that's, I told you the bottom line, right? Tervesti is just sort of giving some basis to it, right? Okay, so what I'll do then to develop that bottom line argument, start with a brief assessment of process analytics today. What are we researching? What are we teaching? And then lay out a three-part research teaching agenda for the further development of this stuff. Okay, to start with process analytics today, the present. Most of what we publish and do, and for those of you who are into this stuff, who have come today, these phrases will be very familiar. Most of what we do and publish today or use in our research is standard process tracing and its close relation, Bayesian process tracing. Now, just a little bit quick definitional stuff here. So standard process tracing, I would say it's a toolkit and guidance on how to go about inferring and measuring the role played by causal mechanisms in producing an outcome. The foundations of this type of process tracing were laid out in two key texts, Beach and Pedersen, a book from the University of Michigan Press, came out in 2 editions, and then in Checkel, that's a book you should buy if you don't have it, okay? It's available in all kinds of formats, and I still need to get my bank transfers from Cambridge. But I mean, these were the 2 sort of important books that came out about this stuff. And what both of these books are doing, right? I mean, they're taking a positivist, critical realist view of the social world and putting it into motion, centering around causal mechanisms and how you measure, see them, okay? In terms of data collection, these books actually say little beyond telling you it's important, do it. Okay, that's helpful. In terms of data analysis, largely we say do it informally. We give some tips like, oh yeah, causal mechanisms. The tricky thing about theorizing in terms of causal mechanisms is multiple causal mechanisms can get you to the same outcome. This problem of equifinality, right? And we have some advice on how to deal with that in your design. But the data analysis is really done through text, in words. You've got a case study, a case narrative, right? And you're documenting the interaction between several causal mechanisms producing the accord. We got it in Paris in 2016, the climate accord, right? Fine. You'll cite, interviews with 3 different individuals, right? And in talking to them, the response to their questions, that was evidence of what you have earlier called the observable implications of your particular causal mechanism. So the data analysis is in the text, right? And it's through words. okay? And it's informal, okay? The style of analysis, I already said this, case narratives, right? That provide evidence of causal mechanisms in action. That's the standard process tracing. Bayesian process tracing. It's about applying a type of logic, Bayesian logic, and math to the data analysis part of standard process tracing. The back end stuff, okay? It has little relevance for data collection, the front end. The foundations here are a series of articles in a 2022 Cambridge book by Tasha Fairfield and Andrew Sherman. And here's Fairfield and Sherman. This is from a 2017 article, but I know the same text is in the 2022 book, but I couldn't find it. So this is the citation from 2017. Here's what they say. Bayesianism is the methodological foundation of process tracing, which entails making causal inferences about a single case by assessing alternative explanations in light of evidence uncovered. It improves analytical transparency and establishes process tracing as a rigorous method. Whoa, it wasn't rigorous before. Okay, that's a great statement. It's also an epistemologically loaded statement. Which I'll come back to. Everything is epistemologically loaded in the social sciences, but I mean, sometimes it's important to dig behind it a bit. Okay, but that's a real, hard sell for Bayesianism. But again, this is the Bayesian process tracing. It's another way of taking the positivist, critical realist motion picture view of the social world, putting that social world into motion. Compared to sort of standard process tracing, it's like on steroids. Right, with the data analysis part. The data collection actually is more disciplined. Okay, as you know what you're looking for, because you can only work deductively with Bayesian process tracing. I'll come back to that. Otherwise, like standard process tracing, Bayesian process tracing has little to say about this front end stuff, the data collection. But the data analysis, this is different now, right? With standard process tracing, I said it's through text, it's informal, right? Well, now the data analysis is through math and quantification. And through math and quantification, your analysis becomes more transparent and accessible. And process tracing becomes a rigorous method, right? Going back to Fairfield and Sherman. The style analysis is, again, case narratives that provide evidence of causal mechanisms in action, but with the addition of appendices, typically appendices, online appendices, where the Bayesian test or math are executed, included. Like Tasha Fairfield, one of her early articles, I think it was the journal World Development about a decade ago. You saw precisely this sort of a case narrative in the main body of the article, and then in an appendix, some Bayesian process tracing test. Okay, so that's the two big things out there right now for sort of getting at and measuring process, standard process tracing and Bayesian process tracing. Let me say a little bit more about the Bayesian stuff, right? Because it's kind of viewed as the cutting edge right now with this process tracing stuff. And I think there's some issues with Bayesian process tracing, and I'll lay out 4. And before I say that, I mean, this is like friendly fire critique. Tasha Fairfield is a good friend. She's coming to EUI to talk about Bayesian process tracing next week. I invited her, okay? We both started out in physics, right? I think you mentioned I did my first degree in physics, but Tasha went further. She got to a master's degree of physics and then went to real science, political science, right? So, she's a great friend. We did not together, but we started out in physics together. And by the way, her co-author now on the Bayesian stuff is a physicist, Andrew Sherman from Berkeley. Okay, yeah, so friendly fire critique, but nothing's perfect, right? So I think there's 4 issues with the Bayesian stuff. Issue number 1, is Bayesian process tracing really process tracing? Process tracing is about gathering data and fitting it to the observable implications of a causal mechanism. Bayesianism is about giving us guidelines for drawing causal inferences from qualitative evidence. Okay, but the phrase Bayesian process tracing then is rather misleading and perhaps should better be called Bayesian qualitative analysis, which actually, to be fair, Tasha Fairfield in her more recent work but that's the way she's characterizing what Bayesianism does. But that's one maybe minor issue, semantics. Second issue, Bayesian process tracing can only be used with deductive standard process tracing. The Bayesian toolkit, you have to start with theoretical priors. You have to start with a theory. Okay. If you're working inductively, that's kind of hard. Okay. That's the second issue. Third issue, the challenge of assigning the initial theoretical priors is a challenge. I would argue we're just hiding, Bayesianism is about getting rid of our subjectivity and getting it out of the whole process, right? All those little stupid tricks we play in our mind, right? Where do you come up with these numbers for the initial theoretical priors? You cook them, you cherry pick them, right? And actually, to be fair, and you guys had Tasha here a year ago. Okay, so you've heard the correct version of this, right? And they have an answer to this one, which I don't buy, right? That you can actually get around this problem, but I don't quite get it. I think it's a problem, right? So the challenge is the third issue, the challenge of assigning the initial theoretical priors, okay? The fourth issue, though, is the one for me that's the biggest. I would call it opportunity cost and roads not taken. Well, if you go whole hog with Bayesian process tracing, inductive forms of process analytics vanish. Interpretive forms of process analytics, which always operate inductively, also vanish. We focus too much on the data analysis at the expense of the equally important data collection that together make up process analytics. And we reduce qualitative transparency, and we're having a huge, big debate about this in qualitative methods, as I'm sure you folks know, right? We reduce qualitative transparency to a practice of formalization and quantification. Show me the goods. It's a very positivist way of thinking about transparency, which is fine, but it's not the whole story. Yes. So after all that, I mean, what's the bottom line? Jeff doesn't like Bayesian process tracing, right? True. But I think I'm in a minority. My notes say jury still out. Okay. Maybe the strengths of Bayesian logic and its application outweigh all these opportunity costs. I don't know at this point. I mean, if you want to see the strongest, it's a slam dunk. It's worth it. Just do it. Case made for Bayesian process tracing. Look at the 2022 Cambridge book by Fairfield, Tasha, and Andrew Sherman. They do a beautiful job of laying it out. Many chapters are non-technical. You don't even need the math or anything, right? And it's a very, I wouldn't say compelling. It's a methods book, right? But I mean, it's very well argued. Okay, so that's like the strongest slam dunk Bayesianism is the future. The strongest, Houston, we've got problems. I don't know. Case. I think at this point is an article by Sherry Zaks, Z-A-K-S, in the journal Political Analysis in 2021, and then she published that article. And then it kicked off a bit of a debate in that journal in 2022 between Zaks and Andy Bennett, Tasha Fairfield, and Andrew Sherman. So you can get a sense of what their debating there. So I don't know. I mean, I had some concerns, right? You guys heard Tasha a year ago, and I'm sure she probably didn't have all these concerns. But I think my view actually is a bit of a minority one. But I guess the jury is still out. Anyway, that's sort of where we are with process analytics today. This process tracing and its close relation, Bayesian process tracing. Now, okay, so I want to move from now to the future. So, process analytics towards a new research agenda. That's what my notes say. Okay, so surprise, I think we need a different new research agenda. I mean, we need more than Bayesian process tracing. We need a broadened research and teaching agenda on this stuff. An agenda that takes seriously the front end data collection. And again, that's sometimes called within process tracing methods. Rethinks, broadens the idea of how we get qualitative transparency, transparency with qualitative methods, and develops a robust interpretive variant of process analytics. So I'm going to work through each of these in turn. Okay, taking data collection seriously. Really, isn't that kind of obvious? Yeah, but I mean, seeing how we teach process analytics, including myself, until more recently, I think we need to devote more time in pedagogy and research to the techniques required to execute the front end, the data collection, and to do it well. When teaching this process stuff, I'm always struck that most students think it all starts when we measure the observable implications of our causal mechanism, or for Bayesians, when we calculate priors on a piece of evidence. But the data for measuring those mechanisms comes from somewhere. Typically interviews, field work, ethnography, political ethnography, archives, surveys, discourse analysis. And just give you a little example of what I'm talking about. A week ago, I was in Berlin at the Freie Universität, at a center of excellence they have there, and I was teaching a 3-day workshop on process stuff, right? And some of the most intense, long debates, discussions, worries on the part of the students were not about the data analysis stuff, about the data collection and the data quality, the quality of the data collection. 2 examples, right? We looked at one book, Inductive Standard Process Tracing. It's a book by Elizabeth Wood at Yale on the Salvadoran Civil War, published in 2004 or 5, where about 80% of her, 75% of her data comes from interviews and 25% ethnographic stuff. And then we looked at and interpreted stuff, a book on practice tracing by Vincent Pilot, who I mentioned from McGill. And he's looking at social practices and tracing them at work in global institutions and how it's producing hierarchy and a very deeply unjust global order, which is a big thing these days. And it's great. Sort of he's focusing on these dynamics, right? And about 90% of his data comes from interviews. And we just had the most ongoing, extensive, worrisome for the students discussions of, okay, Poulot, so he's using interviews. Social practice is implicit background knowledge. How, by talking to somebody, do you see, measure, observe implicit background knowledge? It's implicit. It's behind what I'm saying. Maybe would. I mean, she's okay. She's at the causal mechanisms, but this is asking people why they mobilized to fight a war. Oh, of course, I'm going to tell you, right? I did it because I wanted to take back control of my life, not because we needed land. right? And these are kind of sort of the argument she's pitting against each other. And for her, so the issues was, and the students were talking about, but as you know, people aren't just lying to her. I mean, you've all probably done interviews, right? I mean, my sort of, when I teach this stuff at EUI, sort of, because everyone loves interviews, it's like the most popular qualitative method, right? And, for me, the probably 300 interviews I've done in my career, I would say a third of the people are lying to you, a third are misremembering, and a third are playing you. Well, kind of serious, right? It makes interviewing just in general really hard, right? But then, like, if you're low and you're trying to get a social practice, which is implicit in what they're saying, wow, have fun. Anyway, the most vibrant discussions we had in this process analytics workshop last week were about these upfront data collection methods and how, in these two different ways, these scholars could actually be sure they were inferring the right stuff from talking to people. Okay. And the takeaway I was giving to them was you all need not just this workshop, you need a whole nother workshop on interview methods, right? Or a course, right, on this stuff to make sure you're doing it right. So, okay, we need more attention, I would argue, to this upfront data collection. And I'm not the only one saying this, right? The Sherry Zaks, who's been involved in this debate of the Bayesian process tracing, the article I mentioned a few minutes ago, this is what she has to say. And again, this is embedded in a broader critique of Bayesianism, putting too much emphasis on data analysis as opposed to data collection. This is what she has to say. In the context of qualitative research, scholars have a lot more access to training in the analysis of data than they do in the research processes that get them the data in the first place. But the process of research and processes we are researching are inextricable. Researchers would likely yield greater benefits from intensive training in ethnographic, interview, and sampling techniques, understanding the politics and biases associated with archival work, or even just additional and specialized language training needed to conduct research on a specific topic. Yes, I agree. Okay. And so if you sort of see my future agenda here about, more attention to upfront data collection stuff, the end result would be a process analytics methodological literature built on the understanding that high quality data analysis requires high quality data. Okay, so that's the first of the where we should go next. The second, rethinking qualitative transparency. Now, hear my argument. I just always love to do this. It's not either or, it's both and. So let's do Bayesian logic. Yes, let's use that to get transparency. And something I'm going to call positionality as another way to increase our transparency of our qualitative research. Now, if the application of Bayesian logic allows us to see better through formalization and quantification how we assign causal inferences to data, then reflections on positionality help one see better the social processes shaping that data as it's collected. Positionality, I mean, that's a bit of jargon. It's from the interpretive methods toolkit. It means to reflect on how you're interacting with what you research, and you're both changing through that interaction, right? How you interact with your research object, many of these folks would say your research partner, actually, and how that affects the data you collect. Let me just give a little example here, and it's hypothetical. It's from my own work, but I haven't done it yet. Okay, so it's hypothetical. So I've got a project in a way where part of it is going to involve ethnographic interviews with refugees and immigrants in Germany since 2014-15 about the country's identity debates. And these have gotten, it's happening in a lot of places in the world, but in Germany, a lot of it is keys from the 2015-16 refugee crisis and Germany's initial policy of letting many of the refugees in, and what blowback, what I'm going to call it, from that decision of Merkel. But anyway, so I want to talk to these people but I want to be careful about my positionality in doing this. What does that mean? Okay, well, before I go to the field to Germany, this would be like a 2-month trip, okay? Because it's a bit immersive, and I call these ethnographic interviews. It's typically interviewing the same individual 3 or 4 times. Before going to the field, I would just think through and actually write up, sort of end up in an appendix somewhere. Okay, so how's it going to work? Me, right? Old white guy coming from elite social science institution in Italy, talking to immigrants in Germany, but especially the refugees who are arguably a vulnerable population. So there's likely a power dynamic there. And ahead of time, I'm thinking, well, how can I ameliorate that or even it out, make it a more level playing field? And that's written up as a set of notes, right? Then I go to the field, right, for these 2 months, right? Do a lot of interviews. Every couple of weeks, I sit down, and ethnographically, you would talk about writing up your field notes, right? But this is sort of separate from that. Write up my notes on my positionality and how I think. Okay, so there's been like 12 interviews the last 3 weeks, and interactions were going actually in ways I completely didn't expect. I felt like the power things had been switched, right? They were in control, and I was the one who was like the supplicant or whatever, and sort of writing down, why is that going on, right? Is it the way I'm dressing or whatever? And you do that sort of while you're in the field. And then, okay, you come back from the field, right? And then what I'd argue you should do, you should meet with your research team and sort of talk through, okay, sort of, this is how I think it actually, my presence talking to these people affected me, but also was affecting the answers I got from them. And based on all this and sort of a group exercise of thinking this all through, do I need to sort of modify my research questions or the way I'm asking questions or whatever, okay? And this is all documented. Arguably, it's going to show up in some appendix, right? The end result, right? And it's just sort of an extended example, sort of this positionality aspect of transparency. If you sort of do the Bayesian logic plus the positionality view on transparency, the end result is a process analytics with a richer understanding of qualitative transparency, one that is actually more rigorous as it applies to both data collection, right? That's where the transparency that Fairfield and Sherman are talking about. I'm sorry, data collection, that's the positionality that I'm talking about, right? All these sort of collective, individual and collective thinking about how I'm interacting with this data and the social process is changing both me and the people I'm interacting with, right? And we have the transparency coming in the data analysis part from the application of the Bayesian logic. And I think that's good. That's more transparency, and we want to be transparent. Qualitative researchers these days, or researchers of any sort, right? And there's actually an additional benefit of broadening the way, in the way I'm talking about now, of broadening the way we think about qualitative transparency. Operationalizing transparency as positionality pushes research ethics to the fore, right? It really makes you think, okay, I'm going out to interact with whatever it is, right? And does my interaction with a research participant harm her? Does it benefit her? Should it benefit her? That's actually one of the core things that we're supposed to do. Hardly any of us do it. Does it violate her right to privacy? There's some really nasty debates going on right now about the ethics of maintaining anonymity and privacy and confidentiality, and the real push in some quarters to archive qualitative data, okay, in repositories. Like there's this national Science Foundation funded qualitative data depository, I think it's called at Syracuse University. But there's some real tensions and squaring a circle there, right? So, I mean, thinking of positionality forces you to think about the ethics of what you're doing, right? And I would argue that kind of ethical reflection is much needed in a process analytics literature that has been largely silent on those issues. Mea culpa, look at after you buy the electronic version of the Bennett and Checkel book, search it for the two terms research ethics and ethics. 0 hits. Actually, that might be 1. And that's not right. Okay. That's my second, where we should go next, sort of broadening understanding of qualitative transparency with process analytics. Final, where next? Bringing in, developing an interpretive process analytics. Why bother? 2 reasons. Well, interpretive scholars have been moving in a more processual view of the social world. That was my little stuff I was doing at the beginning, right? The little digression, not just the mainstream folks, right? And the second reason, again, I guess it's more personal. I mean, for me anyway, if this is going on in the social science world, sort of both the mainstream and interpretive social scientists are sort of moving to this more processual motion picture view of the social world, then I think it's my obligation to try to bring these insights into our thinking on process analytics. And at this point, my bet hunch is what I'm going to call practice tracing. I'll say a bit more about this, is the interpretive process analytics we need. Indeed, it's the scholars working on social practices that have come the furthest in developing an interpretive form of process tracing, which is perhaps not surprising, as social practices are all about process. Okay, what is this thing, practice tracing? Well, it accesses, observes, measures social practices. Okay, what is social practices? They're what people do, the practices they enact. They have a powerful effect in shaping the world around us, from new and usually exclusionary bordering practices, the physical borders going up within Schengen, right? The pushback at the borders by Frontex, by the Polish, I guess it was Polish government forces a year and a half ago, from the folks being pushed over the Belarusian border. So from these new and exclusionary bordering practices to the diplomatic practices that lock in and perpetuate a deeply unjust and hierarchical global order. We kind of always have known, I mean, if we have our eyes wide open, the deck stacked in particular ways in terms of the global order, right? But this practice work and practice tracing is generating some really interesting insights to how this comes about. But again, just a bit more on these practices. So it's building on Pierre Bourdieu's concept of habitus by providing a theory of action. And sort of a formal definition, right? And I'm going to spend a little time here because this is maybe newer for people. Practices are socially meaningful pattern actions that simultaneously embody, act out, and possibly reify background knowledge and discourse in and on the material world. In very lay terms, they are ways of doing things. Practices become socially meaningful when they move from the individual to the group level. They make things happen only when they're elevated to the group. Practice scholars call these communities of practice, okay? And this is where the practice tracing comes in.
what are the methods we need to collect data on social practices and then use practice tracing to map and analyze the process through which such practices move from the individual to the collective group level. Now, in contrast to the standard and Bayesian process tracing, which I've argued earlier, hasn't thought that much about the front end data collection stuff, practice tracers are like gaga about this front end data collection. Gaga and all over the place because they can't agree, right? And indeed, they're sort of having big debates over how do we see a social practice? What do we need to do methodologically? What kind of data do we need to collect? They basically all say, well, there is a gold standard. And the gold standard is ethnography. Now, why would it be, right? Social practice, ways of doing things, right? So, best way to observe that, participant observation, right? Be in the room. Watch the diplomats at the UN enact these social practices. Okay. Or the border guards with the pushback stuff, Frontex or whatever. But look at the two examples I just gave. Here's where they really get going to practice people on some big debates. Well, yeah, ethnography is a gold standard, but we often can't get access for ethical or security reasons, right? UN Security Council? Well, some of the meetings, yes, others not. NATO summits, maybe not. Be out there in the field with Frontex. Okay, so we can't do ethnography. Maybe we can just do interviews. And I don't get this, right? But that's one of the argument practice tracers are making, right? Again, all the problems you already have with interviews, right? And then you're really pushing interviews, talking to people, right? Because you're talking to somebody, and by talking to them, you're going to get access to their implicit background knowledge. That's challenging, right? Vincent Pilot, one of the main practice tracers, that's his argument, right? Or maybe you need ethnography a little bit at first, and then that sets you up to do interviews and document analysis. That's another argument out there. So there's a lot of firmament here, right? And a lot more is sort of unsettled compared to process tracing, Bayesian process tracing. But actually, I think that makes it really exciting. And a couple of my students back at the UI are working with this stuff. And I'm telling them, folks, you can make a name for yourself, right? I mean, do this, right? And show them that, like, you do need ethnography or whatever, right? Just, contribute to these debates. It's just really sort of cutting edge stuff in the interpretive way of thinking about process analytics. So the end result, if we develop this interpretive form of process tracing, right, process analytics, they're calling practice tracing, I don't know what the end result is. I mean, the literature is unterwegs. I mean, it's happening right now. It's like 5-7 years behind the standard Bayesian process tracing. But that immaturity, that's not the right way to put it, but I mean that lack of development, right, kind of makes it exciting to sort of be a part of the debates and see what they're doing. Okay, to conclude, I would argue process analytics today are focused on the data analysis part of the method. Tools such as Bayesian logic or set theory, I haven't even mentioned that, in political science, this is the work of Jim Mahoney, allow us to process all that process data in a more systematic way that enhances the validity of our causal claims. As a result, we tell better, more rigorous causal stories. And in all the teaching and research that's sort of making these claims, I think students of process analytics in two ways are following and contributing to broader trends, and I'll say political science here because I'm not sure enough how it's playing out in sociology, but this would be in political science. First, like proponents of experimental designs and causal identification strategies, students of process analytics have focused up until now their efforts on designs and tools that allow us to nail the causal story. Second, like these experimentalists or the proponents of causal identification strategies, there are opportunity costs and roads not taken because of this emphasis on causal data analysis. And that's what I've been trying to document. I mean, there are opportunity costs and roads not taken. If we think of operationalized process analytics as mainly Bayesian analysis and a formalization that comes with that. And for me, sort of watching this whole literature develop over the last 20 years, this is kind of a weird place to be in. Because this process stuff, political science, sociology, at least analytic sociology, I know, when it got started 20 years ago, it was really plural, right? It was actually meta-theoretically plural in that these folks all said, the analytic sociologists, the early political scientists working on this stuff, you know, yeah, mechanisms are a way to put the social world in motion, but there's all kinds of mechanisms. And they don't have to be married to particular social theory, like just rational choice. They can be different kinds of social theories. Habermas, communicative action, a very different kind of social theory, right? So there was a playful pluralism there, which I just thought was great. And equifinality, right? That's sort of the formal telling us, you know, pluralism is okay. Well, I sort of want to go back and recover that pluralism and extend it to the broader scheme of how we're thinking about process analytics. So, you know, we should definitely continue our current efforts at transparency and formalization. I think that the Bayesian stuff is a very useful tool to formalize in one way and to make the process analytics more transparent in one way. But we need, in doing that, we need to recognize there are multiple ways to improve the method. And that's going to mean traveling down epistemological, methodological, and ethical roads currently not taken or sort of put a bit to the side. And I think the result, if we sort of broaden the agenda in this more pluralistic direction, will be a richer method that nails the data analysis, which we care about, but a whole lot else.